In this video, we are going to learn why India supports Palestine. I will also briefly tell you what happened post 1948, that is after the creation of Israeli state. Then we will also learn what were the main reasons that triggered the recent Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in the end, I'll end this video on few comments about Middle Eastern ethno-religion politics. Alright then, without any further ado, let's begin. Let me begin with a small realistic life philosophy which says, what you see on the surface is not what you will find under. तो ऐसा ही कुछ एक रिलेशन है इंडिया और इजराइल के बीच. Recently you must have heard this statement of T.N. Tirumurti, who is the Indian representative at the United Nations. He said India strongly supports the Palestinian cause. If you notice, there's a word called reaffirmed. It means confirming the validity of something previously established. That means India's support to Palestine is part of India's old foreign policy that began during the Nehruvian era. As you all know that Jawaharlal Nehru was the first Prime Minister of India. After 1947, the Indian economy was in a very poor state. India's development strategy began on a socialistic approach under the leadership of first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. In fact, the concept of five-year plan was first implemented in the Soviet Union in 1928 by Joseph Stalin. Jawaharlal Nehru was inspired by Stalin's plan. If you know the full form of USSR, it is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Officially, the USSR was a federal socialist state. Nehru was inspired from it, and that is how after independence, India's development strategy began on a socialistic approach. So after 1947, the Indian National Congress made India follow largely whatever the Soviet Union did. And Soviet Union used to support Palestine. Likewise, India also started supporting Palestine. In simple words, whatever Soviet Union did, India also very much followed that. If I have to summarize the last 100 years in terms of distribution of power, then it is something like this. Before the First World War, the entire world was a unipolar world. If you remember, before 1914, when the First World War started, different empires were fighting with each other. The Western European countries like the Dutch, Britain, French were ruling different parts of the world by forming colonies, which were also referred to as colonial rule. Similarly, there was the Russian Empire, then Prussian Empire in Germany. Most part of the Middle East was under the Ottoman Empire. So all these empires had their own territory where they exercised military, cultural and economic power. They also used to expand their territory to gain more and more influence. And this continued till Second World War. This is what we refer to as a unipolar world. The Second World War ended in 1945. After 1947, the Cold War started. It was a period of ideological and geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. In other words, the entire world became a bipolar world. You could only support the USSR or the United States. These two were the only major powers. So this continued till 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and since then the world became a multipolar world. After 1991, India also opened its market to the outside world through the LPG reforms. And today, as we know, there are multiple superpowers. You have the 5 veto countries, United States, UK, France, China, Russia. Then you have Germany, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, Australia. And then there are emerging superpowers like Argentina, India. You will notice all these countries exercise their influence in some form or the other. That is how we come to this conclusion that there has been a dramatic change in world politics and the balance of power. It has moved from the bipolar world to a multipolar world. When it comes to India, on the surface or at face value, it has always adopted the policy of non-alignment. In other words, India adopted the middle path. Because we knew that the moment we supported one country, we would automatically become the enemy of the opposite country. So to avoid such kind of political disadvantages at international level, India thought of maintaining the middle path. As I've said, this policy was just to show it to the world. In reality, you have to take a side. When it comes to buying weapons, ammunition and other military equipment, you will have to take a side as to whom to buy from. The moment you decide your client, the world is going to tag you, irrespective of what you say. So like that, India at the surface or at the face value followed the policy of non-alignment. But it very much maintained its close relations with the Soviet Union, which later became Russia. The MiG aircrafts, Sukhoi, S-400 missiles, joint cooperation of BrahMos missiles, many submarines, etc. came from joint cooperation with Russia. Since 1950, India is the world's biggest arms importer. Till the late 90s, Russia was India's first choice. Now, as we know, India imports from many countries, including the United States. So that is how today, when you hear India supporting Palestine at the United Nations, it is purely because of historical reasons. That is the right context of understanding India's statement. Now let's try to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I will try to explain everything in a simple way so that you have a clear picture, and I hope I will be able to give you a great amount of clarity. First, let me show you the map of Israel and Palestine. This is the West Bank territory. You must be wondering, in Israel it is on the eastern side, then why is it named as West Bank? Well, West Bank used to be part of Jordan's territory, and if you see it from Jordan's side, it lies on the western side. That is why it is named as West Bank. And by the way, majority of the population of Jordan is Palestinians. Jordan conquered the West Bank territory in 1948 during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But after that, Israeli took it back. If you want to understand the Jewish history, I have made a separate video on it. I'll put the link of that video in description. If you are interested, please watch it. If you look at the history, it goes around 2000 years back. But if you just want to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it began only after 1900. The First World War started in 1914. During that time, Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. The First World War was fought between the Allied powers and the Central powers. During the First World War, the British openly promised the Jewish community through Balfour Declaration of 1917 to give them a homeland in Palestine. In return, the British wanted Jewish support against the Central Power and Ottoman Empire. See, you have to understand one thing. Jews lived in Palestine since ages. Their numbers were small, but they lived in Palestine and Jerusalem since ages. So don't think that it is because of British, Jews ended up in Palestine. Palestine and Jerusalem were the place of residence within the Jewish people's hearts since ages. The British only made a deal with the Jews to give them recognition in return of their support during the war. As we all know, the Central Powers lost in the First World War. In Europe, the Prussian Empire lost, and in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire disintegrated and was partitioned after its defeat. After the end of the World War I, the map of the Middle East was redrawn and divided up between the European powers, mainly between France and Britain. Palestine and Jordan territory came under the British control. After the end of the First World War, all Ottoman-controlled territories eventually became fully independent states, except Palestine. Britain was still controlling Palestine, and on the other hand, British also had to give a separate homeland to the Jewish people, which they had promised as per the Balfour Declaration of 1917. From 1922 till 1947, Britain allowed large-scale Jewish migration in Palestine, mainly from Eastern Europe and other parts of Mediterranean and Western Europe. Millions of Jewish people migrated to Palestine in a span of 10 to 15 years. Obviously, the Arabs living in Palestine did not like this large-scale immigration of Jews. Palestinian Arabs started protesting against the British and were demanding independence in 1937. Situation turned violent in late 1920s. Palestine was infested with terrorism and violence. Jews and Muslims developed strong hatred towards each other. Then World War II started in 1939. Hitler killed many Jews in Nazi Germany concentration camps after coming to power in 1933, which is also referred to as the period of Holocaust. As a result of that, many Jews from Eastern Europe migrated to British Palestine. So obviously, Jewish population increased tremendously till 1945. Even then, it wasn't more than the Arab Palestinians. British tried different formulas to resolve Jews and Arab conflict, but nothing worked. Then in 1947, the British handed over the Palestinian problem to the United Nations. After looking at alternatives, the United Nations proposed the partitioning of British Palestine into two independent states. One was for the Palestinian Arabs and the other was the Jewish state. Since Jerusalem was the holy site of three religions, United Nations decided to bring Jerusalem under its own control and made it a special international zone. The Jews accepted this plan and declared independence of Israel on 14th May 1948. However, the Arabs were against it. They saw the United Nations partitioning of Palestine as an attempt to spread Western countries' influence in the Middle East. That means till 1948, when the United Nations partitioned Palestine and gave a separate state to the Israelis, the map of Israel looked like this. And by the way, the point to be noted is that Israel declared itself as a full-fledged country by accepting the United Nations plan. And they did not create a Palestinian state, neither they accepted Israel as a country. That is why you will see names like West Bank, Gaza Strip. You will not see it as Palestine. That means in 1948, the Jews were happy with whatever land they had got as their homeland. Plus, if you look at the map, you will realize that the partitioning of British Palestine was done in such a way that in 1948, if a Palestine had to travel from West Bank to Gaza Strip or from West Bank to Acre, they had to obtain an Israeli permit. And that made the Arabs angry. So overall, the United Nations partitioned Palestine into an area of Jewish land, 3 Arab areas, and Jerusalem under international control. Now what the Arabs did was, immediately next day, that is on 15th May 1948, the day after Israeli independence, Arab forces from Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, North Yemen and Lebanon formed the Arab League and had put together the Arab Liberation Army full of volunteers to fight against the Jews. They surrounded Israel from all 3 sides and started attacking. If you look at the emblem of the Arab Liberation Army, you can judge for yourself how much hatred the Arab world had against the Jews. In return, Israel started giving military training to its population and even sent their agents to Europe to retrieve World War II stocks and signed armed contracts. Anyhow, this gave rise to the First Arab-Israeli War. So this war went for almost 1 year and ended on 10th March 1949. By the end of this war, Israel dominated the war and won more territory. This was the new map of Israel after the 1949 war. As you can see, western part of Jerusalem came under Israel's control. Eastern part of Gaza came under Israel's control, and the whole city of Acre in North Israel came under Israel's control. On the other hand, Jordan annexed and gained control of the West Bank, and Egypt gained control of the Gaza Strip. After the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs left and fled the Israeli territory and moved into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria and Egypt. On the other hand, Jewish communities who lived in many Arab countries since ages were also forced to leave, and they all took shelter in the Israeli territory. Many Jewish people, especially the European Jews, were extremely happy to come back to their homeland and choose to settle there. This kind of movement on the both sides continued till 1967. In between, in the year 1956, there was a second Arab-Israeli War, which is also referred to as the Suez Crisis or tripartite aggression. Britain, France and Israeli military attacked Egypt on 29 October 1956 with the intention to acquire the Sinai Peninsula and take over the Suez Canal. Because the Egyptian government had nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956, these countries realized the importance of Suez Canal in maritime trade. As you know, Suez Canal is the lifeline for all trade between the West and the East, and they had concerns having it under the control of an Arab country. However, there was a political pressure from the United States, the Soviet Union and the United Nations, which led to the withdrawal of Britain, France and Israel. On 2nd June 1964, PLO, that is Palestine Liberation Organization, was founded. However, it did not come into limelight until the end of Third Arab-Israeli War. Then in June 1967, the Third Arab-Israeli War took place. It is also known as June War or Six-Day War. It was fought between the combined group of Egypt, Jordan and Syria against Israel. The nations of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Algeria and others also contributed troops and arms to the Arab forces. In 6 days, Israel dominated the war and acquires whole of West Bank territory from Jordan, Golan Heights from Syria, Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt. When Israeli forces occupied the Sinai Peninsula in 1967, in return Egypt closed the Suez Canal. It was closed till 1975, that is for almost 8 years. In 1975, Egypt and Israel signed a disengagement accord. The Suez Canal was reopened in June 1975. Then a peace treaty was signed between Egypt and Israel in 1979, after which the Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt. After acquiring West Bank, Gaza Strip and Golan Heights, Israeli settlers began to move into Palestinian territories. Even the United Nations condemned the Israeli occupation. But I would request you not to judge too early. Let's put a marker here and we will get back to this Israeli occupation issue, whether it is right or wrong in a while. Anyhow, 6 years later, in October 1973, Egypt and Syria launches a surprise attack on Israel for recapturing their lost territories. They attacked on the holiest day of Jewish faith, Yom Kippur. This day is also referred to as Jewish New Year. In fact, there is a small tradition that the Jews follow. Almost 2000 years ago, when the Jewish people were expelled and forced to leave from Jerusalem. After all, King David conquered Jerusalem and made it the capital of Jewish kingdom. His son Solomon built the first holy temple about 40 years later. So when the Jewish were expelled from Jerusalem 2000 years ago, all the Jewish communities who migrated to various parts of the world, they used to take wine on this day and raise a toast while saying this phrase, Lashana Hababa Yerushalayim, which means next year we will be together in Jerusalem. The Jews have been following this tradition since 2000 years, so you can imagine their love and integrity for their homeland. Anyhow, that is why this war is also named as Yom Kippur War. Since it was a surprise attack, Egypt and Syria crossed the ceasefire lines in the Sinai and Golan Heights respectively. Since it was also the era of Cold War, Soviet Union supported the Arab countries against Israel. Looking at this, the United States sends emergency supplies of 22,000 tons of weaponry to Israel. With the American help, Israeli army further continues to push its borders. After ceasefire, all the oil-exporting Arab countries decided to punish the United States and Israel's allies by increasing the price of oil by 70% and decreasing production by 5%. This caused the first oil crisis of 1973. As I've told you in the previous point, in 1975 Egypt and Israel signed a disengagement accord. And after that, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt and some part of the Golan Heights to Syria. After the end of 1973 war, Israel still had control of the whole of West Bank, Gaza Strip and the remaining part of Golan Heights. By 1980, Israeli settlers occupied many streets in East Jerusalem. In 1987, the Palestinian population rebels against Israeli government. Situation got violent and the Palestinians started pelting stones at the Israeli forces. This was the beginning of the first Intifada, which is an Arab term meaning uprising. From here you will notice the rise of Hamas. It is the Palestinian Sunni Islamic fundamentalist organization whose aim is to liberate Palestine from the Israeli occupation. In 2007, Hamas was designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, Canada, European Union, Israel and Japan. Then from early 90s, peace efforts between Palestine and Israel begins. 1993 peace agreement was signed between Israel and Palestine, which is also called the Oslo Accord. As per this agreement, there was a mutual recognition between the Israeli government and PLO. Israel actually acknowledged PLO as a Palestinian authority who will be running limited self-governance in the city of Jericho in West Bank and few parts of Gaza Strip. But keep in mind, the Oslo Accord, however, did not create a Palestinian state. This tells us that the Israeli government were open to peace talks, otherwise they wouldn't have acknowledged to PLO as a Palestinian authority with limited self-governance. Then in 1995, Israeli-Palestinian Interim Agreement on the West Bank and Gaza Strip was signed on 28 September in Washington, D.C. As per the agreement, the Israeli civil administration will hand over the administration to the new Palestinian interim government, and the Israeli military will withdraw by transferring powers and responsibility to PLO. Yasser Arafat, leader of the PLO, arrived in Gaza to take charge of the new Palestinian Authority. In January 1996, the newly installed Palestinian Authority held its first democratic elections to choose an 88-member Palestinian Legislative Council. Yasser Arafat was elected president of the Palestinian Authority. While all of this was going on, Israel was open to peace talks, even acknowledged PLO as a Palestinian authority. However, there were disagreements on many issues, such as the status of Jerusalem and the return of Palestinian refugees. Because you have to understand this, Israeli government were open to peaceful negotiation with the Palestinians, but at the same time, the Israelis were also suspicious of the Palestinian future plans. Then in the year 2000, second uprising, that is Intifada, occurs, followed by many suicide bombings. In 2002, Israel begins the construction of wall in the West Bank territory to protect its own people and country. In the next 4 years, the Israeli government built a long wall, and if you look at it from the Israeli point of view, it was necessary for their security. As I have said, suicide bombing was on the rise since 2000. And by the way, while building the wall, in few places the Israeli government even encroached the Palestinian territory, which actually triggered anger within the Palestinians. This was even condemned by the International Court of Justice. But then, as you know, Israel doesn't really care about anyone's point of view, especially when it is about their own security. That is why Israel is at top, among the most safest and secured country in the world. By 2005, Israeli government removed all the Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip. In 2006 election, Hamas gained a large majority of seats in the Palestinian parliament. After coming into power, Hamas used to regularly fire rockets into Israeli territories. That is when in 2007, Hamas was designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, Canada, European Union, Israel and Japan. By 2014, there were many clashes between Gaza and Israel. In response, Israeli planes also caused destruction in Gaza, and that caused a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. On December 6, 2017, President Trump formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and stated that the American embassy would be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. and that triggered more rebels among the Palestinians. Today, the situation is very complicated. To understand this conflict, you will have to use your brains to the highest degree. You cannot get carried away by emotions and what you see on the media, especially by CNN, Al Jazeera, and many other such outlets. You have to know things in its actual context. So let's see what exactly happened. Here are the three major issues that led to the 2021 Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On 6th May, Palestinians protested in East Jerusalem over an anticipated decision of the Supreme Court of Israel on the eviction of 6 Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. It is a neighborhood of East Jerusalem. The protest then escalated into violent confrontations between Jewish and Palestinian protesters. Then on 7th May, Israeli police raided the compound of the Al-Aqsa mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, located on the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism. The Israeli police used tear gas, rubber bullets and stun grenades in response to stone-throwing Palestinians. On 10th May, Hamas gave Israel an ultimatum to withdraw security forces from the Temple Mount complex and Sheikh Jarrah. On the same day, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad began firing rockets into Israel from the Gaza Strip. So these are the three primary reasons that triggered the 2021 Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first one is property dispute in Sheikh Jarrah, the second one is Israeli police raid in Al-Aqsa mosque, and the third one is Hamas firing rockets on Israel. Now let's analyze these three situations one by one. Because if you watch some emotional video where they will show you Palestinians getting hit by the Israeli police, that will not give you the whole picture. That will just tell you one side of the story. And to be very frank, we all have to agree with this fact that the Israelis don't give a shit about what anyone thinks of them. They are not going to sit in front of the world and justify their actions to you and I. They know what they are doing, and even if nobody stands with them, they are fine. They haven't asked anyone's help and they have been facing violence since ages if you look at their history. So this incident is nothing new for them. Apart from United States, they really don't care about anyone because a lot of their military and technological market depends on the American market. Apart from United States, I don't think Israelis care about anyone's opinion. Anyhow, let's analyze the first problem. We all know that in 1948, Israel was created. United Nations gave 3 areas to Palestinians. Then a Jewish state and Jerusalem came under international zone. Then, as we all know, immediately next day on 15th May 1948, the Arab forces attacked Israel from all 3 sides. After the end of the war, Israel gained control of the western side of Jerusalem, eastern part of Gaza, and the whole city of Acre in North Israel came under Israel's control. In 1956, 28 Palestinian families settled in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem. These 28 families had an agreement with the Jordanian Ministry of Construction and Development and the UN Refugee Agency UNRWA to provide housing for them in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. At that time, West Bank came under Jordanian rule. So basically, the Jordanian government gave the land and the United Nations Refugee Agency paid the cost of constructing 28 homes for these 28 families. Now this process got interrupted in 1967 when the Third Arab-Israeli War took place, which is also known as the June War or 6-Day War. And as we all know, in 6 days, Israel dominated the war and acquires whole of West Bank territory from Jordan, Golan Heights from Syria, Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt. Now you should understand this, it was the Arab countries who again started the war first with Israel in 1967. The Palestinian Fedayeen attack, meaning suicide attacks, were carried out against Israel. That's what led to the 1967 June War. But anyhow, by the end of this war, Israel conquered the West Bank territory. That means the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem in 1967 came under Israeli control. Today, this 28 family has grown into 38 families. And by the way, you should not forget that these 28 families are refugees. The Israelis who are now settled in these homes, their association has property papers, which shows that they have purchased this land from the Arabs in 1875 during the Ottoman rule. The Ottoman land registry records showed the property was registered in the names of Avram Ashkenazi and Meir Orbach. In response, the Palestinian refugee lawyers have questioned the authenticity of the document, which was verified by an Israeli court, and they have stated that the document of Jewish ownership was authentic. On the other hand, the Palestinian refugees don't have any legal paper. The Jordanian government couldn't give them proper documents. When the Jordanian government was asked about this incident, they simply said that the process was interrupted due to 1967 war. So in simple terms, the Jewish people have papers and the Palestinian refugee don't have any property papers. And even in the 1860s and 1870s, this neighborhood was a Jewish neighborhood. Then of course, as we all know, the British occupied the Palestine province. Being an Indian, we all know how good the British are in demarcating land borders. Even in India during the partition, the British did not consciously do the partition of India. That is why so many people died in India while migrating. So what we can learn is that the British did not care about giving justice to the people whom they had ruled. In fact, they drew happiness from human and societal suffering. So we all can collectively agree that the British did a lot of blunders. But then oppressed people at that time didn't have that far-sightedness. They were simply happy for the fact that the Britishers are going. You get what I'm trying to say, right? So what you need to understand is that this neighborhood was initially a Jewish neighborhood. But after 1948, the West Bank went to Jordan as per the UN partition. On the other hand, it was the Arabs who were not satisfied. That's how they collectively attacked one single country. They underestimated Israel. In response, Israel conquered their land in 1967. After 1967, when Israel controlled the West Bank, so obviously the original Jewish owners will claim their land, right? After all, they have their property papers. And Israel as a country did not steal West Bank. It acquired it by winning a war. The Jewish owners are also telling to the Israeli Supreme Court that we have the papers and we have paid money and bought it. Even the Israeli Supreme Court spoke a little in favor of the Palestinian refugees. The court said to the Jewish owners, "Look, we get you have the papers, but these Palestinian refugees have been living here for a long time now." So if you see, Israeli Supreme Court speaking a little in favor of the Palestinians shows that there is some neutrality in the Israeli justice system. In fact, the Supreme Court even said to the Palestinians that, look, you can stay here but give the Jewish owners some rent. Then you will get a protected tenant status. That means nobody can move you out. The Palestinians said no to that also. In other words, the Palestinians are saying that we will continue to stay here and we will not even pay you rent, and even if we don't have documents, it is our house. This is a clear case of property law. This is how you have to look at this problem, and that's when you can come to a fair conclusion. The Western media has hidden all this information and have only showed what suits their narrative, and they gave it a new cover story by calling it racial eviction. Whereas if you analyze it carefully, there's nothing racist about it. It is a simple case of land grabbing, which comes under property law. Now to all my Indian viewers, by looking at this property dispute of Sheikh Jarrah, does it remind you of any similar situation in India? On 19 January 1990, lakhs of Kashmiri Pandits and Sikh people were forced to leave Kashmir. Many were killed, massacred, raped, looted, forcibly converted by Islamic settlers. Hateful slogans were announced from the loudspeakers of mosques and issue fatwa saying Kashmiri Pandits were kafirs. So many Hindus and Sikh left their own houses, lands and properties. What do you think happened to their properties? They were grabbed and occupied by Muslims who lived there. For 30 years, these Kashmiri Pandits have been living in refugee camps of Jammu. You will see many of these Kashmiri Pandits as roadside vendors near Dilli Hath, South Extension, Malviya Nagar, Patel Nagar and other parts of the city. Do you think Kashmiri Pandits will go back and claim their land and properties? Do you even think when they were running away from their houses, they were carrying their property papers? They very well know where their properties are. They can very well locate it. But do you think will they get their properties back? So naturally, today it will be difficult for these people to go back to Kashmir and claim their land and property. It can only happen with government support. And I must also point out one thing. After going through so much, not even a single Kashmiri Pandit turned hostile or turned into an armed rebel. So if you see, Palestine case is nothing in front of this. The land dispute of Sheikh Jarrah is a simple property dispute of land grabbing. The Israeli owners have property documents. They were kicked out after 1948 when West Bank went to Jordan, and the Palestinians who are currently residing are refugees. They don't have any document and they also don't want to pay any rent. The Jordanian government had placed them illegally in 1956. And I also feel if these Palestinian people had cooperated with the Israeli government or justice system, then I'm sure they would have got something in return. There are so many arrangements that the government can do, provide low-cost housing or reallocation, etc. You have to cooperate with this system. If you consider yourself as Israeli Palestinians, then you cannot always protest and throw stones at the authority. Our Kashmiri Pandits did not become hostile. In fact, if you see, Indian Kashmiri Muslims in Kashmir throw stones at the Indian army. The Kashmiri Muslims get all the protection and benefits from Indian taxpayers. In return, they throw stones at the Indian armed forces. So can you see the pattern? You can get away doing that in India, but that is Israel, that is not India. You are not going to gain anything from the Israeli system if you throw stones and firebombs at them. In return, the system will be harsh on you. So today the Palestinians are accusing Jewish original landowners of grabbing their properties in Sheikh Jarrah. Then those Palestinians are no different. Even their ancestors have kicked the Jewish out in 1948 and took over their land without papers. And then neighboring Arab countries collectively attacked on Israel. Is that fair? And if Israel conquered the land after defeating its enemies in 1967 war, then what's the matter? Israel is a democracy. Arabs are living in Israel. So why don't these Palestinians support Israeli nationhood? If they can't do that, then they can move to Jordan, which has majority of Palestinians. If you look at the total population of Arabs living in West Bank and Gaza Strip, it is roughly around 20 lakhs. The population of the state of Israel is 90 lakhs. So today, if the Arabs are in minority in Israel, if they don't fight with the Israelis, they can live happily. But instead, they are going against them. And when Israeli government retaliates, they play victim card. If suppose the Palestinian Arabs were in majority and Jews were in minority, do you think they would have left these Jews? They would have either killed them or converted them. Hamas, who rules the Gaza Strip, they're openly saying that we will throw Israelis into the sea and we'll do ethnic cleansing. So the day the Palestinian population increases, they will wipe out the Jews. Israelis are aware of this. They're not going to sit and wait for that day. Their policies are very straightforward. If they see any threat, they will deal with it in advance. That is why I said to understand this conflict, you need to use your brain to the highest degree. You cannot get carried away by looking at few videos which are emotional and one-sided. I'm not against the Palestinians. In fact, the Israeli Supreme Court has also spoken a little in favor of them and said, just pay the rent and live peacefully. But there is no gain in being hostile. You have to look for a peaceful way. Lands, properties, it is our ancestral possession. Grabbing it and illegally settling there is not the right thing to do. We have good examples in India. I'm talking about Kashmiri Pandits. They never complained of being unfair. Of course, they feel sad, but they have moved on. And more importantly, they never became hostile. But in the case of Israel, the Israeli government is not like the Indian government. So they have their own way of dealing things. One should not even expect softness from Israel. When the entire Arab nation have said, we will push the Jews into the sea, kill all the Jews. So Israelis have their own threat perception and they will deal with it accordingly. As far as the first problem goes, the property dispute in Sheikh Jarrah, I hope now this problem is much clearer to you and I hope you have gained some perspective. Now let's look at the second problem, Israeli police raid in Al-Aqsa mosque. There is a clear footage that shows the Palestinian crowds first started throwing stones and other objects at the Israeli police officers. That is when, in response, the Israeli police started clearing the crowd by throwing tear gas and stun grenades, not directly at the people, on empty grounds. Obviously, the Israeli police is going to clear the crowd. Nobody expects any police in any country to be sweet and polite when there is a potential threat. And those are rubber bullets, they're not real bullets. Now this part of the footage was taken by one of the Palestinian protesters. So this angle might be a little confusing as to who initiated this clash. Now have a look at this video, which was released by the Israeli police. Because Israeli police were smart. Nowadays even the Indian government is doing that, which is a good thing. Government should have their own filming crew. In this footage, you will see that the Palestinian protesters were throwing a petrol bomb at the Israeli police. And look at this scene. The Israeli police is pushing them away. That is the standard procedure for any country's police. Here in India, during COVID lockdown days, you take your bike out, the police makes you dance like anything. So clearing the crowd is a standard procedure. Here the Palestinians attacked first. Just remember one thing, the whole West Bank and Jerusalem is under Israel's control. But the administration is shared by both the Israeli government and Fatah, which is a Palestinian authority. If you remember, in the 90s, the peace process began between Israel and Palestine. In 1993, a peace agreement was signed between Israel and Palestine, which is also called Oslo Accord. As per that agreement, there was a mutual recognition between the Israeli government and PLO. So in a nutshell, the creation of Palestinian Authority was actually agreed through mutual understanding by the Israeli government. So presently, the West Bank is partially governed by the Palestinian Authority called Fatah. However, law and order remains in the hand of Israeli government. That is why you will see only Israeli police. On the other hand, the Gaza Strip is currently under the control of Hamas. And I've already mentioned, Hamas is a designated terrorist organization. However, the Palestinian staying in Israel supports Hamas and PLO. The Palestinians consider these two organizations as their saviors. So anyhow, the Palestinian protesters attacked the Israeli police and Jews first, with a firebomb, stone and other objects. In response, the Israeli police evacuated the compound by lathi charge for restoring law and order. You will also find another footage where the Jewish people are dancing and jumping and raising their Israeli flag, while there is a fire going on at a distance. So this kind of video makes you feel that how can the Jewish people be happy when something is burning? And many on the internet might even assume that maybe they are happy because the Palestinians are being beaten by the police. Again, that is not true. If you look at this incident from the other side of the wall, it is the Palestinian protesters who have set the tree on fire. They were protesting in response to the Israeli Supreme Court's hearing on the Sheikh Jarrah property dispute case. The Supreme Court hearing was only for 6 Palestinian families. Just imagine, for 6 Palestinian families, this much of violence was orchestrated. So you see what is happening. These things are being done just to gain attention of the international media. And the third reason that led to the 2021 Palestinian-Israeli conflict was when Hamas launched rockets into Israel from Gaza. In response to the Al-Aqsa and Sheikh Jarrah incident, they fired more than 4,000 rockets at Israel, some hitting deeper inside Israeli territory and with greater accuracy than ever before. So you see how everything is being orchestrated. 6 Palestinian families property dispute, then Supreme Court hearing, Al-Aqsa mosque incident, then Palestinian protesters throw firebomb first and then burn the tree. In response, Israeli police used water cannon, rubber bullets, stun grenade to restore law and order. Even some police have got hurt, just like the Palestinians. And finally, Hamas launched more than 4,000 rockets from Gaza onto Israel. In response, when Israel fired, the Palestinians in Gaza started playing victim card. Up till now, everything was an internal conflict. The moment Hamas fired rockets, followed by Hezbollah from South Lebanon, it all became an external enemy threat. In simple words, we call it war. So you see how a small property dispute transformed into a large-scale war. And you will be surprised when you hear people's logic, such as, so what, Hamas fired rockets, Israel has Iron Dome. Hamas knows its rockets are not going to cause any harm to any Israeli. It was just to teach Israelis a lesson. When you are firing more than 4,000 rockets on a country, the intention is to wipe out the entire human race of that country. People need to understand this, that the Arabs are not able to digest the Jewish Israelis. The Israelis are giving the Arabs doses of their own medicines. If the Arab Muslims are aggressive, Israelis are showing firmness in return. Then you also must have heard in the news that the Israelis have taken down Al Jazeera and Associated Press building in Gaza. If you all don't know, Al Jazeera is Qatar's satellite TV network that was launched in 1996. It is fully funded by the Qatari royal family. This TV network has collaborated with many terrorist organizations in the past like Hezbollah, Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. Even in Kashmir, if you read their articles, Al Jazeera portrays the militants like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba as freedom fighters. Even Muslim countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE and Bahrain have kicked Al Jazeera bureaus out of their countries and have accused Qatar for sponsoring and harboring terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Gulf Cooperation Council group has also officially published a list of 59 individuals and 12 institutions linked to terrorist organizations that receive support from Qatar. And this has also been one of the reasons behind the Qatar diplomatic crisis that started in 2017 and ended in 2021. Anyhow, so it is quite an open fact that Qatar harbors as well as supports many terrorist organizations. So naturally, even the Israelis are aware of it. That is why they have shot down its building in Gaza. Israel also attacked the home of Hamas leader. And I must also point out that before hitting any target, the Israeli military personnel have been giving advance warnings to the civilian population. That is the character of a model army. On the other hand, you will see that Hamas always hides behind civilians, especially women and children. Always play a victim card when it gets counter-hit from the Israelis. Now, if you pay attention, Hamas controls Gaza and it is a Palestinian Sunni radical Islamic group. On the other hand, Hezbollah is a Lebanese Shia radical Islamic group. Even Hezbollah has fired rockets from southern Lebanon towards Israel. The Hezbollah terror group has also dug a network of tunnels hundreds of kilometers long from Beirut to southern Lebanon for infiltrating Hezbollah terrorists in northern Israel. Anyways, so Hamas is a Palestinian Sunni radical Islamic group and Hezbollah is a Lebanese Shia radical Islamic group. That means Hezbollah is supported by Iran because Iran is the only Muslim country which has large population of Shias, and we also know Iran is a nuclear state. Now what is surprising to see is that since childhood we have heard that the Sunnis and Shias don't get along well with each other. They have sectarian divides from last 1400 years. Then within Sunnis, they have Muqallid and Gair Muqallid. Under Muqallid, they have 4 categories. In that one category is Hanafi. Even under Hanafi, they have Devbandi and Barelvi. Under Devbandi, they have 2 more, Hayati and Mamati. So if you see, these are deep fault lines within Islam if one sits down and explores. What is surprising for me in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that both Sunni and Shia radical groups are united against Israel. I also don't understand what is the relation between Indian Muslims and Palestine. What is the relation between Pakistan Muslim and Palestine? What is the relation between Iran Shia Muslims and Sunni Palestinians? Nobody is asking these questions. These are very important questions. Just go and look up who is the leader of Hezbollah. It is Hassan Nasrallah. He is a Lebanese Shia Muslim. He is not even Iranian. However, since he is the leader of Hezbollah, then his allegiance has to be towards Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Now, if you look at which are those Islamic radical organizations that are fighting against Israel, they are Hamas, which is Sunni, PLO, that is Sunni, Hezbollah, it is Shia, and other Islamic jihadi organizations. That means there is no sectarian divide among these radical terror outfits. Everyone is united and cooperating in this conflict against Israel. You must have even heard that the Taliban is cooperating with Iran these days. So it is quite interesting to see this cooperation. So what you have to realize is that at the back end, these organizations have met, sat together, and have done a great deal of negotiations to achieve the ultimate goal of re-establishing a super Islamic state. Once that is achieved, then they will fight among themselves and sort it out. There is an old Arab saying, I against my brother, I and my brother against my cousin, I, my brother and my cousin against the world. So this kind of Sunni-Shia reunion is always carried out by poor people. In the case of Kashmir, we have seen all the militants are young people who belong to poor socio-economic backgrounds. Similarly, these poor Israeli Palestinians are also being used by these radical Islamic organizations for continuing their agenda. And it is working. You will find that an average Israeli Palestinian hates Jews, and they are also teaching the same to their children. And those innocent children, when they grow up, they will grow up with this mindset. Again, I will point out the Kashmiri Pandits. It's been 30 years, not even a single Kashmiri Pandit or their children have picked up any arms. And there are many more such examples in the world. So one has to be aware of all these things. Israelis are aware of these temporary agreements between various radical Islamic organizations and how they are brainwashing innocent people. Israelis are vocal about it as well as fighting against it. That is why most of the Arab nations don't like Israel. So that's it then. This was everything that you had to know about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I hope you found this video informative. Thank you for watching it.